My name is Gracie Palmer, and I'm a 27-year-old lieutenant in the United States Army. They say the military forges you, but I was forged in hell long before I ever put on the uniform. That night, on a deserted stretch of Riley Road just outside of Fort Liberty, hell found me again. The phone rang, and the ice-cold voice of my stepfather, Richard, came through. "I just want to talk." Seconds later, a red laser dot danced across my steering wheel. My training saved my life. I yanked the wheel just as the first bullet turned my windshield into diamond dust, the tiny shards stinging my cheeks like fire. The second shot tore through the hood. The car flipped, and a searing pain shot through my chest as my own blood soaked through my uniform. Before I blacked out, I heard his voice echoing in my head. "Some problems just need to be erased." He was wrong. He didn't erase me. He just gave me my final mission. Let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you believe no soldier deserves to be ambushed, especially not in their own backyard. This story is my declaration of war. The quiet of a late North Carolina night has a sound all its own. It's a low hum of crickets, the whisper of wind through towering longleaf pines, and the steady crunch of tires on asphalt. After 3 straight days of field training exercises, that sound was the only music I needed. My body ached in the satisfying way that tells you you've pushed your limits, and my mind was blissfully empty. I had the windows of my Honda down, letting the cool, humid air wash over me, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. On the radio, a gravelly voice that sounded like Chris Stapleton was singing about a broken heart and a bottle of whiskey. A classic country ballad that felt like a perfect soundtrack to this rare moment of peace. I was less than 10 miles from the main gate of Fort Liberty. Home. Or the closest thing I'd had to one in years. My weekend plans were gloriously simple. Sleep for 12 hours straight. Meet Maggie for brunch at our favorite spot in Fayetteville, and maybe do absolutely nothing else. A normal weekend. That's all I wanted. A slice of the ordinary life I'd fought so hard to build for myself. A life dictated by my own terms, not by the suffocating silent rules of the house I grew up in. My phone buzzed in the center console, its screen lighting up the dark cabin. The name displayed on the screen shattered the peace instantly. Richard. My stomach clenched. It was a conditioned reflex, a tightening in my gut I'd known since I was a child. He never called unless he wanted something, unless he had a complaint, unless he needed to remind me of my place. I let it ring, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. 4 rings. 5, I should just ignore it. Nothing good could come from answering, but a deeper, older instinct, the instinct of a child trained to respond, took over. I pressed the button on my steering wheel. "What do you want, Richard?" My voice was flat, professional. The voice of Lieutenant Palmer, not the voice of a stepdaughter. His was the opposite. It was calm, almost syrupy, a terrifyingly placid tone he only used when he was about to strike. "Is that any way to greet your father?" "You're not my father." The words were automatic, a shield I'd polished for years. A low chuckle came through the speakers, a sound like gravel grinding together. "Still so defiant? I just called to talk, Gracie, to remind you of a few things." There was a pause. I could almost picture him sitting in his worn leather armchair, the house silent around him, my mother probably moving like a ghost in the kitchen, pretending not to hear. "A daughter should know her place, Gracie." The line went dead. But the threat lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. An old, familiar dread began to creep up my spine, the feeling of being watched, the feeling of a predator closing in on its prey. That's when I saw the headlights. They appeared in my rearview mirror, 2 bright orbs that seemed to materialize out of the darkness. At first, I thought nothing of it. This was a rural road, and pickup trucks were as common as pine trees in North Carolina. I kept my speed steady, my eyes on the winding road ahead. But the headlights stayed there, perfectly paced with me, too close for comfort. They didn't pass. They just hung back, a constant menacing presence. I tapped my brakes lightly, a signal for him to back off. The truck behind me did the same, maintaining its distance with chilling precision. My casual annoyance began to curdle into suspicion. I sped up a little, pushing the needle to 60. The truck's engine roared in response, effortlessly keeping pace. This wasn't a random driver. My training kicked into high gear, overriding any civilian fear with cold, tactical analysis. My heart wasn't pounding with panic. It was a steady, rhythmic drum of adrenaline. I was no longer a woman driving home. I was an officer in a potentially hostile situation. My eyes scanned everything: the dark tree line, the empty shoulders of the road, the single unblinking eye of the rearview mirror. The truck was a dark mass, a Ford F-150 or a Dodge Ram, big and imposing. Its grille filled my mirror like the jaws of some great beast. I couldn't see the driver, only the blinding glare of his high beams. He was herding me, keeping me on this isolated stretch of road. Then, I saw it. A flicker of movement inside my car. A tiny, perfect circle of red light dancing on my steering wheel, right over my knuckles. A laser sight. There was no time to think, only to react. My body moved before my mind could even process the terror. I cranked the wheel hard to the left, throwing the car into a skid just as the night exploded in a deafening crack. My windshield didn't just break. It vaporized into a million glittering fragments, a violent spray of glass that peppered my face and arms, each tiny piece a burning sting. Another crack echoed, closer this time. A fist made of metal punched through the engine block. The steering wheel was ripped from my hands as the front tires blew. And the world became a horrifying blur of green and black as the car left the road. There was a moment of weightlessness, a silent, terrifying grace before the impact. The car hit the ditch, and the world became a symphony of destruction. The shriek of tortured metal, the explosive pop of airbags, the violent, bone-jarring tumble as the car rolled. Once, twice. My head slammed against the side window, and my universe dissolved into a shower of white-hot stars. The car came to rest upside down, the roof crushed against the damp North Carolina soil. Silence. The only sound was a faint hissing from the ruined engine and the slow, steady drip. Drip, drip of liquid. Gasoline. Or maybe blood. I couldn't tell. I was hanging upside down, held in place only by my seatbelt, which cut deep into my shoulder. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. A sharp, searing pain radiated from my chest, so intense it stole my breath. I looked down. My uniform, my crisp army greens, were stained a dark, wet crimson. Through the shattered remnants of my window, I heard the squeal of tires on asphalt as the truck sped away, its job presumably done. He hadn't even stopped to check. No hesitation. Just cold, brutal efficiency. My vision was tunneling, the edges turning gray and fuzzy. My hand, trembling and useless, tried to reach for the radio on my shoulder. I had to call it in. I had to. A voice crackled through the static of my own radio, distant and panicked. Palmer, do you copy? Lieutenant Palmer, what's your status? Over. It was Captain Foster. He must have been nearby. The wail of sirens began to grow in the distance, a lonely sound cutting through the night. I felt hands on me, pulling at the door, trying to get me out. Foster's face appeared in the broken window, a mask of grim determination. As they pulled me from the wreckage, my world began to fade to black. But just before the darkness took me, one final memory flashed through my mind with perfect, horrifying clarity. It was from a few months ago. I was standing in the hallway of my mother's house, and I could hear Richard in the kitchen, his back to me. He was speaking to my mother in that same, calm voice he'd used on the phone tonight. "It's just a business problem, Evelyn," he'd said. "And some business problems just need to be handled." I was the problem. Lying on the wet grass, with Foster leaning over me, I used the last ounce of air in my lungs. My voice was barely a whisper, a ragged breath escaping my lips. "It was Richard," I rasped, my eyes locking with his. "He did this." And then, nothing. The first thing you notice when you wake up in a hospital is the sound. It's a low-level symphony of beeps from distant machines, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes in the hallway, and the hushed whispers of nurses. Then comes the sterile, antiseptic smell. And finally, the pain itself hits you. For me, it was a dull, throbbing ache in my chest, a fire that flared with every breath. But that physical pain was just an echo of a deeper, older pain I had carried for years. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling tiles, the morphine drip doing its best to dull the edges, the pain in my ribs pulled me back. Not to the wreckage on Riley Road, but to another kind of wreckage. It pulled me back to a pristine, two-story house in Wilmington, North Carolina. It pulled me back to the house without laughter. My childhood home wasn't a home. It was a command post, and retired Sergeant Richard Hale was its commanding officer. He ran our family like a boot camp, governed by a rigid, unspoken code. Dinner was served at precisely 6 p.m. The table was always set with military precision, forks aligned, napkins folded into stiff triangles. The only sounds during our meals were the rhythmic clicks of silverware against porcelain plates. Laughter was a foreign language. Conversation was a breach of protocol. Order, Richard used to say, his voice a low rumble, is the foundation of honor. I knew, even as a child, that was a lie. In our house, order was the foundation of fear. My mother, Evelyn, was a ghost in this silent world. She drifted from room to room, her movements small and quiet, her eyes constantly darting towards Richard, anticipating his moods, extinguishing tiny fires of imperfection before he could even notice them. A crumb on the counter, a magazine on the coffee table, these were potential landmines. She was the master of de-escalation, a peacekeeper in a war only she and I knew was being waged every single day. Her silence was her shield, and in protecting her own fragile peace, she left me utterly defenseless. My real father was a hero, a soldier who died in service before I was old enough to remember him. My only connection was a small dusty box I found in my mother's closet when I was 16. It was filled with old photographs of a smiling young man in uniform, his eyes full of a life that had been cut short. I took one picture, a wallet-sized photo of him alone, looking proud and strong. I propped it up on my desk, a tiny secret shrine. It was my own small act of rebellion, a claim to a past that was mine and mine alone. It lasted less than a day. Richard found it during one of his random inspections. He didn't yell. Yelling would have been a relief. Instead, he picked up the photograph, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something dirty. His eyes, cold and gray like a winter sky, met mine. "There's only one soldier in this house," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "And that's me. Don't live in the past, Gracie." He walked down the stairs to the kitchen fireplace. I followed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Without breaking eye contact, he tossed the photograph into the flames. I watched as the edges curled, turned black, and the smiling face of my father dissolved into a wisp of gray smoke. It wasn't just cruel, it was an erasure. It was Richard's way of telling me I wasn't allowed to have an identity he did not control. The final wall of my prison was built the year I turned 17. I was a good student, my grades were my escape route. Then the letter came. A thick, creamy envelope with the crest of Duke University. They were inviting me for a final interview for a full academic scholarship. I remember holding it, my whole body trembling. This was it. A full ride to one of the best universities in the country. A future I could build for myself, 100 miles away from Wilmington. I hid the letter under my mattress, a secret treasure. A promise of a life that had color and sound and laughter. Richard, of course, found it. He had a sixth sense for hope. He could smell it and had to extinguish it. That evening, he called me into the living room. "At attention, Gracie," he commanded. My mother stood by the doorway, wringing her hands, her face pale. Richard held my letter and read it aloud, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He savored every word, twisting my greatest achievement into an act of betrayal. When he finished, he looked at me, a cruel smirk on his lips. "Duke University," he sneered. "You think you're smart enough to go there? You think you're better than this family?" Before I could answer, he tore the letter in half, then in half again. The sound of the ripping paper was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that house. He let the pieces of my future flutter to the floor. "Your place is here," he said, his voice a low growl. "Under my guidance. You are not leaving." I looked at my mother, pleading with my eyes for her to say something. To be a mother. She just stood there, silent tears tracking down her cheeks, a prisoner who had long ago surrendered. Her silence was his greatest weapon. If you've ever had a dream, big or small, that someone in your life tried to tear up right in front of you, hit that like button right now to show your support for this fight. And I want you to do one more thing for me. In the comments below, just write one word, the name of that dream. Whether it was college, music, business, love, whatever it was, let's create a long list of all the dreams they couldn't kill. That night, in my room, I didn't cry. There was only a vast, cold emptiness inside me. But as the hours passed, something else began to glow in that emptiness. A tiny, hot ember of resolve. He had won the battle, but I would not let him win the war. The next day at school, I went to the guidance counselor's office. With the steady hands of a soldier preparing her weapon, I stole a pamphlet for the Army ROTC scholarship program. The irony was bitter, but the path was clear. I would escape a tyrant in a uniform by putting on one of my own. I would take the very thing he used to control me, discipline, order, strength, and make it my own. That night, I opened my journal. On a clean page, I wrote the words that would become the compass for the rest of my life. "He can destroy a letter," I wrote, "but he can't destroy me. I will leave. I will be stronger than him." It was a silent vow, and it was a promise I intended to keep. The day I left for basic training was the first day of the rest of my life. There was no tearful goodbye, no proud family sending their daughter off to serve. Richard stood on the porch, arms crossed, a smug look on his face. He'd already thrown my duffel bag onto the lawn. "The world's gonna chew you up and spit you out, Palmer," he said, not even using my first name. "Don't you come crawling back here when it does." My mother slipped out the door behind him. She pressed a crumpled $50 bill into my hand, her fingers trembling. Her hug was quick, almost frantic, a bird brushing against me before taking flight. It wasn't a hug of support, it was one of surrender. I didn't hug her back. I just turned, picked up my bag, and walked to the waiting taxi without looking back. On the Greyhound bus to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, I watched the pines and strip malls of Wilmington disappear. I didn't cry. The emptiness I'd felt after Richard tore up my future had been replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. For the first time, there was no one watching me, no one judging my posture or listening for the wrong tone in my voice. There was just the low rumble of the bus and the endless stretch of American highway. I was completely alone, and it felt like breathing. The infamous harshness of military training didn't scare me. For me, the screaming drill sergeants and grueling demands were a structured, predictable kind of hell. An escape with clear rules, a far cry from the chaotic tyranny I'd left behind. Officer Candidate School was where the real forging began. It was a relentless crucible designed to break you down and rebuild you as a leader. The days were a blur of physical training that left my muscles screaming, sleepless nights studying field manuals, and constant pressure. We learned land navigation until we could read a topographical map in our sleep, and were tested on military law until the articles were burned into our brains. It was brutal, but it was fair. The rules were the same for everyone. The hardest part wasn't the physical exhaustion or the mental strain. It was the loneliness. Mail call was a daily ritual of hope and heartbreak. I'd watch as other candidates' faces lit up, their names called to receive letters and care packages from home, filled with homemade cookies, beef jerky, and photos, little pieces of the world they were fighting for. Their mail slots were always full. Mine was always empty. Every day I'd walk past my name, Palmer, G, and see nothing but the cold, dark metal at the back of the box. No letters of encouragement, no packages of cheap snacks, nothing. In that small, empty space, I felt the full weight of my isolation. I was a ghost, a soldier with no one waving from the shore. The breaking point came during a 20-mile ruck march in a torrential Georgia downpour. We'd been marching for hours. The 45-pound pack felt fused to my spine, its straps digging raw trenches into my shoulders. Rain plastered my hair to my face, and every step was a battle against the thick, sucking mud. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead. I was falling behind. My drill sergeant, a tough-as-nails man named Sergeant Reyes, got in my face, his voice cutting through the rain. "What's the matter, Palmer? Can't keep up? I knew it. You're not strong enough for this." His words hit me like a physical blow. They were Richard's words, dressed in a different uniform. "You're not good enough. You're not strong enough." For a second, the 17-year-old girl watching her dreams get torn apart almost gave up. My body wanted to quit, to just collapse into the mud and let it be over. But then, something else sparked in my mind. A memory from a late-night study break a few weeks earlier. I'd stumbled upon a TED Talk by a researcher named Brené Brown. I didn't understand all of it then, but one line had stuck with me. She said, "Vulnerability is not weakness." Richard had taught me that strength was a hard, impenetrable shell, about never showing pain or admitting fear. But standing there in the rain, on the verge of collapse, I realized he was wrong. True strength wasn't about not falling down. It was about the courage to get back up, again and again. It was about being vulnerable enough to feel the pain and keep moving anyway. I looked Sergeant Reyes dead in the eye, took a deep, ragged breath, and cinched the strap on my pack. I adjusted my rifle, planted my boot in the mud, and pushed forward. I finished that march not because I was afraid of him, but for myself. Each step was a silent declaration. I am strong enough. After that day, something shifted. I didn't just survive OCS, I started to thrive. The discipline Richard had wielded like a weapon, I now used as a tool. I found my niche in logistics, the complex world of getting supplies and people where they needed to be. I had a mind for it, a knack for seeing patterns in the chaos. I was methodical, efficient, and reliable. Slowly, I earned respect. It wasn't given freely. It was forged in late-night planning sessions, in perfectly executed training missions, and in the quiet competence of my work. My peers started coming to me for advice. My superior officers started giving me more responsibility. For the first time in my life, I was being judged solely on what I could do, on the merits of my own hard work. The feeling was intoxicating, like breathing fresh air after a lifetime in a sealed room. Years passed. I took assignments overseas, learned new languages, and saw parts of the world I'd only read about. I was promoted to first lieutenant. The ghost of the girl in the house without laughter was fading, replaced by a confident, capable officer. The past was finally starting to feel like the past. Then the orders came. I was in my small office in Germany when I opened the official manila envelope. My fingers traced the crisp text until they stopped on one line. New duty station, Fort Liberty, North Carolina. My heart stopped, just for a second. Fate has a cruel sense of humor. The one place on earth I'd run from, the place that held all my ghosts, was where the army was sending me back, the epicenter of my own personal war. That night, I stood before the mirror in my barracks room. I saw the officer staring back, the sharp lines of my uniform, the bars on my collar, the steady look in my eyes. This was not the frightened 17-year-old who had scribbled a promise in a journal. "I'm not that kid anymore," I whispered to my reflection. "This time will be different." But deep inside, beneath the uniform and the years of hard-won confidence, a familiar, cold tendril of fear began to stir. I was going home. In the drifting gray fog of half-consciousness, I heard voices. They were muffled, distorted by the painkillers and the ringing in my ears, but they were anchors in the darkness. They weren't the voices from my childhood, not Richard's cold commands or my mother's frightened whispers. These were different. One voice was firm, steady, cutting through the haze with a quiet authority I recognized instantly. It was Captain Drew Foster. "Do whatever it takes," he was saying to a doctor, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's one of mine." One of mine. The words echoed in the void. In all my years in Richard's house, I was never one of his. I was a problem, a disappointment, an object to be controlled. But here, broken and bleeding in a hospital bed, I was one of his. Then another voice, closer, softer. It was Sergeant Maggie Rowe, my best friend in the unit, my rock. "Hang in there, G," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're right here with you." They were lifelines. In the deepest, most terrifying moments of my life, I'd always been alone. But their voices promised something different. They were a quiet promise that this time, I wasn't. When my eyes finally fluttered open, the first thing I saw wasn't a doctor or a nurse. It was Captain Foster, slumped in the uncomfortable visitor's chair by my bed. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He was still in the same duty uniform from the night before, now smudged with dirt and what looked like my own dried blood from where he must have helped pull me from the wreck. He had been there all night. My captain? My commander. Not my mother. He must have sensed me stirring because his head snapped up. The fatigue in his eyes was instantly replaced by a profound, overwhelming relief. He didn't bombard me with questions about the attack. He didn't ask for a report. He just stood up, poured a small cup of water from the plastic pitcher on the bedside table, and helped me take a sip. "Just rest, Lieutenant," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll handle things at the unit. Your only job right now is to heal." In that moment, he wasn't Captain Foster, my commanding officer. He was the image of a father I'd only ever dreamed of. A protector, not a warden. His steady presence was a silent, powerful affirmation that I was valued, that I was safe. It was a feeling so foreign, so deeply yearned for, that it brought tears to my eyes. Maggie came every single day. She wasn't the kind of person to bring flowers or get-well-soon cards. Maggie was practical. Her gifts were lifelines of normalcy. On the first day, she brought a worn paperback copy of a thriller I'd been wanting to read. The next, a batch of her famously bad oatmeal raisin cookies. They were burnt on the bottom, but they tasted like love. But her greatest gift was her presence. She'd sit for hours, filling the sterile silence of the hospital room with mindless gossip from the unit, complaining about the new supply sergeant, and telling me ridiculously bad jokes until I'd let out a pained laugh. She understood that healing wasn't just about medicine and stitches. It was about being reminded that there was a world outside these four walls waiting for you, a life you still belonged to. One afternoon, she came in with a laundry basket. "Hospital gowns are depressing," she announced. She helped me sit up and gently washed my hair in a basin, her movements careful and sure. The feeling of her fingers massaging my scalp was one of the most tender things I'd ever experienced. Afterwards, she helped me into an old, faded olive drab t-shirt from one of our old unit deployments. It was ridiculously large on me, but it was soft against my skin and smelled faintly of laundry detergent and her. "Better," she said, smiling. "Now you look like a soldier again." It was these small, unspoken acts of kindness that began to mend the wounds the bullet couldn't touch. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not a performance of perfection, but a quiet, steady presence in the chaos. A few days later, 2 investigators from the Army's Criminal Investigation Command, CID, came to take my official statement. They were professional, but I could feel their skepticism radiating across the room. A decorated officer claiming her own stepfather, a respected retired NCO, tried to have her killed. It sounded like a movie plot. I told them everything, my voice low but steady, but their polite nods and noncommittal phrases told me they weren't convinced. Captain Foster had been standing quietly in the corner of the room the entire time. As they were packing up their notepads, preparing to leave with their thinly veiled doubts, he stepped forward. "Let me be clear," he said, and his voice had that sharp, commanding edge that made everyone stop and listen. "Lieutenant Palmer is one of the most reliable and level-headed officers under my command. Her integrity is beyond reproach. If she tells you something happened, you can take that to the bank. You should listen to her." The investigator's posture changed immediately. The weight of a captain's word, his unwavering defense of his subordinate, was a powerful force. They left with promises of a full and thorough investigation. After the door closed behind them, Captain Foster turned to me. The commander was gone, and the protector was back. "I believe you, Gracie," he said, using my first name for one of the very first times. 100%. And you are not going through this alone. We are not going to let that happen. That was the moment the fire returned. The trust in his eyes, the simple, unconditional belief he offered me, was the spark. The fear that had been a cold knot in my stomach for days finally began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning anger. He believed me. Maggie believed me. My family, my real family, had my back. And with them behind me, I knew I could fight. The events of that night on Riley Road didn't begin with a laser sight. They began 3 months earlier, with a drive back home. After getting my orders for Fort Liberty, I decided to make the 2-hour drive to Wilmington to see my mother. It was a mistake. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, the familiar tension coiling in my stomach. The house hadn't changed. It stood exactly as I remembered, immaculately clean, eerily silent, and suffocating under Richard's invisible reign. His photographs were everywhere. Richard in his dress blues, Richard shaking a local politician's hand, Richard holding a ridiculously large fish. It was a shrine to him. He greeted me at the door not with a hug, but with a limp, dismissive handshake. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Guess you got tired of playing hero and decided to come home." My mother rushed forward, wrapping me in a hug that felt brittle and hesitant. Her body was stiff, and I could feel the tremor in her hands. Over my shoulder, her eyes darted nervously toward Richard, as if seeking his permission for this small act of affection. The gesture, meant to be welcoming, felt like a performance for his benefit. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. My mother had made my old favorite, pulled pork with coleslaw and cornbread, but the taste of ash filled my mouth. Richard dominated the table, turning it into his personal lecture hall. I tried to talk about my work, my responsibilities as a logistics officer. He would interrupt me, correcting my use of military terminology with a condescending chuckle, as if I were a child playing dress-up in a uniform I hadn't earned. "We called it a forward operating base, not a contingency location in my day, Gracie," he'd say, leaning back in his chair. But I suppose the Army's gotten soft. I clenched the fork in my hand, my knuckles turning white. I looked to my mother for support, for a flicker of defense, anything. But she just stared down at her plate, meticulously shredding a piece of pork with her fork. The final blow came when he launched into a story. "You know," he began, looking directly at me, "I once knew this female soldier, thought she was hot stuff, smart, ambitious. But she was too sensitive, couldn't handle the pressure. The Army isn't for the faint of heart." He took a long, slow sip of his iced tea, his eyes never leaving mine. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a direct assault, a public execution of my career, my choices, my very character. The room felt small, the air thick and unbreathable. I met his gaze, my own eyes cold and steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I turned to my mother, a silent plea in my eyes. "Say something. Please." She wouldn't look at me. She just picked up her own glass and said, her voice barely a whisper, "Eat your food, dear. It's getting cold." Her silence was louder than his insults. It was a betrayal so profound it stole the air from my lungs. In her refusal to defend me, she had chosen him. She had chosen the abuser over her own daughter. Later, when Richard went to the den to watch TV, I cornered her in the kitchen as she was loading the dishwasher. "Mom, what's going on?" I asked, my voice low. "You seem on edge." She avoided my eyes, her hands scrubbing furiously at a plate that was already clean. "Everything is fine, Gracie. Richard's just been under a lot of stress." "What kind of stress?" I pressed. "The finances? Are you guys okay?" That was the trigger. Her composure crumbled. The plate slipped from her grasp and clattered into the sink. She leaned against the counter, her shoulders shaking as silent tears streamed down her face. "He lost it, Gracie," she whispered, her voice choked with a fear that was years in the making. "All of it. The investments, they went bad. He took out a second mortgage on the house. He didn't even tell me until the bank called. I stood there, stunned into silence. The perfect house, the perfect life. It was all a lie, built on a foundation of debt and deceit. Her next words were what truly broke me. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a desperate, pleading terror. He says he can fix it. He has a plan. He says you're part of the problem, Gracie, because you're so independent, because you never help. The accusation hit me like a physical slap. He had not only squandered their future, but had twisted it, reframing my success, my independence, the very things I'd fought so hard for, as a betrayal. He had made me the villain in a story of his own making, and my mother was delivering the script. Before I left, as I stood at the front door, my mother grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her knuckles white. There was a wild look in her eyes, a raw fear that I had never seen up close before. "Gracie, promise me," she said, her voice a frantic whisper. "Promise me you'll be careful driving back to base. Just don't make him any angrier. Please." It wasn't a mother's concern for her daughter's safety. It was a warning, a plea from one prisoner to another. She knew what he was capable of. She knew how dangerous he could be when he felt cornered, and yet she did nothing. She chose her own fragile peace over my safety. She chose to stay in the cage and tried to pull me back in with her. I pulled my arm from her grasp and walked out into the cool night air without another word. The 2-hour drive back to Fort Liberty felt like an escape. I was halfway there, on a dark, empty stretch of I-40, when my phone rang. The screen displayed Richard's name. My training screamed at me not to answer, but some morbid curiosity made me press the button. His voice was calm, devoid of any emotion. It was the calm of a predator. "You drive too fast at night, Gracie," he said, the words perfectly even. "You should be more careful. Consider this a reminder." He hung up. A cold dread washed over me, the kind of primal fear that bypasses thought and goes straight to the bone. My eyes scanned the darkness, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. A few minutes later, through my rearview mirror, I saw the headlights of a large truck appear far behind me, and then a small dancing red dot appeared on my dashboard. The days in the hospital blurred into a monotonous cycle of pain medication, physical therapy, and staring at the acoustic tile ceiling. The physical healing was slow, a dull, constant ache in my ribs, and a sharp, pulling sensation where they had stitched my shoulder. But the real war was being fought in my head. My phone, which the Army had returned to me, buzzed one afternoon. A text from an unknown number. Just 4 words. "You should have died." And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the message vanished. A feature of certain messaging apps. It was gone, but the chilling imprint remained burned onto my mind. It was a confirmation. This wasn't a one-time event born of a desperate financial situation. This was a hunt. And I was still the prey. That feeling of being hunted intensified when the CID investigators returned. Their polite skepticism from the first visit had hardened into a professional, almost bored suspicion. They asked the same questions again, but this time with a different edge, hinting that maybe the trauma had clouded my judgment, that perhaps I'd misinterpreted a random act of violence. I felt like I was screaming into a soundproof room, my words echoing back at me, unheard. I was a lieutenant in the United States Army, a decorated officer, and they were looking at me like I was a hysterical child. The feeling of powerlessness was a thick, suffocating blanket. But the true suffocation began when my mother walked in. She came alone this time. She carried a small bouquet of grocery store carnations that looked as tired and sad as she did. She sat in the chair Captain Foster had occupied, but she didn't radiate his protective strength. She radiated fear. She reached out and took my hand. Her skin was cold, her touch clammy. "Gracie," she began, her voice a low, pleading whisper. "Honey, I need you to listen to me." I waited, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. "I need you to tell them it was an accident," she said, her eyes avoiding mine. "A robbery gone wrong. Richard is under so much stress right now. These financial problems. He's not himself. If you press this, If you make this a big deal, we will lose everything. The house, the pension, everything. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been touched by a snake. The air left my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. Lose everything? I repeated, my voice shaking with a fury I didn't know I possessed. Mother, I almost lost my life. He tried to kill me. Her face crumpled, and the tears came, the same manipulative tears I had seen 100 times before. He wasn't trying to kill you. He was just trying to scare you. By shooting at my car on a dark road? I shot back, my voice rising. Then, she did it. She deployed the weapon she had always kept in reserve, the one she knew I was defenseless against. She leaned forward, her voice dropping, thick with false piety. Your father, your real father. He wouldn't want this, she whispered, her words twisting like a knife in my oldest wound. He was a man of honor. He would want you to protect the family, not tear it apart. And just like that, something inside me shattered. The fear. The years of ingrained obedience. The desperate, childish hope that one day she might choose me. It all dissolved, burned away by a white-hot, pristine rage. It was a fury so clean and so cold it felt like peace. The shaking stopped. The pain in my shoulder faded to a dull throb. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time not as my mother, but as the woman who stood by and watched a monster try to erase me. I saw her for what she was, a coward, clinging to the wreckage of a life she was too afraid to leave. My voice, when it came out, was not my own. It was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. Don't you ever, I said, each word a perfectly formed shard of ice, speak his name again. My father was a hero. He died for this country. The man you are protecting is a coward who tried to shoot his daughter in the back. You made your choice a long time ago, Evelyn. I let her name hang in the air between us, a final severing. Now, get out. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, the tears frozen on her cheeks. She had never heard this voice from me before. She finally stood, her movements jerky and uncertain, and stumbled out of the room, leaving the sad carnations on the table. When the door clicked shut, a wave of the most painful liberation I have ever known washed over me. The final thread was cut. I was completely, utterly, and finally alone. And in that moment, I had never felt stronger. I was no longer a victim being hunted. I was a soldier with a mission. And if you're on my team for what comes next, hit that like button and comment, "Game on," down below. Because the game was just beginning. A few hours later, Maggie came for her daily visit, her arms full of contraband snacks. She must have seen the change in my eyes immediately because her cheerful smile faltered. Gee, you okay? I looked at her, my best friend, my real family. A fierce, protective love for her and for Captain Foster filled my chest. They were my line in the sand. I'm better than okay, I said, and the voice was still there, the new one. The one that didn't break. Maggie, I need you to do something for me. I need you to go to the PX and get me a notebook and a pen. One of those green, hardcover, write in the rain ones, the kind they issue to us in the field. She looked at me, a slow smile spreading across her face. She understood. This wasn't a request for a diary, this was a request for ammunition. They want proof, don't they? I said, looking out the hospital window toward the distant tree line. They think I'm just some confused, emotional woman. I turned back to Maggie, a cold smile of my own touching my lips. Fine. Let's start a logbook. Game on. The words game on weren't just a declaration. They were a shift in the tectonic plates of my existence. The moment Maggie left my hospital room, the fog of victimhood burned away, replaced by the cold, clear focus of a mission briefing. The pain was still there, a constant grinding reminder in my shoulder and ribs, but it was no longer the center of my universe. It was just data, a parameter to be managed. After I was discharged, my first official act was a meeting with Captain Foster. I formally requested a temporary transfer to a desk assignment, citing my physical limitations during recovery. On paper, it was a logical step for an officer on medical leave. I was assigned to a quiet corner in the intelligence liaison office, a place where paperwork went to die. It was perfect. They saw a wounded soldier taking it easy. I saw a forward operating base. My new weapon wasn't a rifle. It was a government-issued computer with secure network access. My battlefield wasn't a dusty road in some foreign country. It was the sprawling digital landscape of public records, financial statements, and forgotten online footprints. And every night, after the last officer initialed their last report and the fluorescent lights hummed over empty desks, my office became the command center for what I had officially logged in my green notebook as Operation Palmer. The fear I'd felt on Riley Road had been transmuted into pure, unadulterated focus. The grief from my mother's betrayal was channeled into a methodical, relentless energy. I started with the thread she had given me, Richard's financial troubles. My training as a logistics officer was surprisingly applicable. I was trained to see patterns, to track supply lines, to understand how assets moved from one point to another. I applied that same thinking to Richard's life. Using open-source intelligence techniques, OSINT as we called it, I began to map his financial network. I spent hours sifting through property records from the new Hanover County Clerk's office, cross-referencing LLCs he'd set up years ago, and tracing the digital breadcrumbs of his failed business ventures. It was like planning a convoy through hostile territory. Each piece of data was a checkpoint, each connection a potential ambush. I discovered a web of debt, bad investments in a local marina, and a second mortgage on the Wilmington house that my mother clearly knew nothing about. He hadn't just been losing money. He was drowning in a sea of his own arrogance and bad decisions. The respected retired master sergeant was a fraud, and his carefully constructed image was about to crumble. One night, while running a deep scan on my personal laptop from home, a flicker of suspicion made me pause. A process was running in the background, something I didn't recognize, cleverly disguised as a system utility. It was spyware. My blood ran cold. He was watching me. He had been watching me all along. The casual check-in calls, the questions about my work. It was all surveillance. But instead of panic, a cold, calculated calm settled over me. He thought he had the upper hand. He was wrong. From that moment on, my personal laptop became a tool of deception. I used it for mundane searches, recipes for chicken parmesan, reviews for new running shoes, articles about army promotions. I let it paint a picture of a soldier focused on her recovery and career. Meanwhile, the real investigation continued on the secure, shielded government computer in my deserted office. The hunter thought he was watching the prey, but the prey was now setting the trap. Weeks turned into a month. My evidence board, a cork board in my small on-base apartment, was growing. I felt like one of those detectives in the movies, connecting strings between photos and documents. It was a tangible representation of his desperation. But I still lacked the smoking gun, the direct link from his financial ruin to the bullets that tore through my car. And then, I found it. It was almost 3 a.m. My eyes were burning from staring at the screen, fueled by black coffee and sheer stubbornness. I was digging through a series of bank statements from a secondary account Richard had opened in my mother's name. An account she was clearly unaware of. And there it was. A single wire transfer made 1 week to the day before the attack. $12,000. My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't the amount that made me stop breathing. It was the recipient. The transfer was made to a registered business in Tennessee, Mercer Security Services. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my tactical training kicking in. A quick search of Tennessee business registries gave me the owner's name, Clint Mercer. Another search, this time through a public records database, pulled up his military history. Former Marine Corps scout sniper. A decorated combat veteran. And then, the final piece. A dishonorable discharge for aggravated assault. This was it. The link. The gun for hire. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made me dizzy. I methodically downloaded every document, the bank statement, the business registration, Mercer's service record, his discharge papers. I saved everything to an encrypted external hard drive, then scrubbed my computer's access logs, leaving no trace. Back in my apartment, the first hints of dawn were painting the North Carolina sky. I stood before my evidence board, I printed a grainy photo of Clint Mercer and pinned it next to Richard's smug, smiling face. I connected them with a thick, red piece of yarn. The picture was complete. The prey had the hunter in her sights. I was no longer the girl who flinched at his voice. I was no longer the victim bleeding on the side of the road. I was First Lieutenant Gracie Palmer, and I was running an intelligence operation. I looked at the photo of the man who had tormented my entire life, the man who thought he could simply erase me. And I whispered to the empty room, "You should have finished the job, Richard, because now I'm coming for you." The name Clint Mercer was a compass point. It gave my mission a true north. The days following its discovery were a blur of controlled, deliberate planning. I put in for a 4-day leave, telling Captain Foster and Maggie I was visiting a cousin in Nashville. It was a plausible lie, close enough to the truth to be believable. The truth was my destination was a small, unincorporated town just outside Clarksville, Tennessee, a stone's throw from the gates of Fort Campbell. The 8-hour drive from North Carolina was a straight shot west on I-40. As the rolling hills of the Appalachians gave way to the flatter, broader landscape of Tennessee, I felt a strange sense of calm. My heart wasn't pounding with fear or rage. It was beating with the slow, steady rhythm of a soldier on approach to a target. My hands were steady on the wheel of my unremarkable sedan. I wasn't Gracie Palmer, the victim. I was First Lieutenant Palmer, executing a reconnaissance mission. I had spent weeks building a pattern of life for Clint Mercer. He was a creature of habit. He worked odd security jobs, drank at the same dive bar 3 nights a week, and lived in a rundown trailer park. The bar was my objective. It was called the Rusted Barrel. I pulled into the gravel parking lot just after sundown. The place was exactly what you'd expect. A low-slung building with flickering neon beer signs in the windows. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, old cigarette smoke, and a hint of desperation. Country music played from a jukebox in the corner, the sound tinny and sad. I scanned the room, and there he was, sitting alone in a booth in the back, nursing a glass of amber liquid. He looked older than his file photo, his face etched with the kind of weariness that doesn't come from a lack of sleep. My training kicked in. I ordered a club soda from the bartender, my movements measured and calm. I walked over to his booth, my footsteps silent on the sticky floor. I slid into the seat opposite him. For a long moment, I said nothing. I just reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of my own military service record. My photo, my rank, my name. I placed it on the table between us. He stared at the paper, his eyes tracing the official Army letterhead. Then he slowly lifted his gaze to meet mine. There was no shock in his eyes, no fear, just a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. A flicker of recognition dawned, followed by a slow, resigned nod. "First Lieutenant Palmer," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I was wondering when you'd find me." My heart was a drum against my ribs, but my voice was steady. I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, but only one word came out. "Why?" He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving mine. "Richard Hale," he started, the name sounding like an obscenity in the dim light. "He said you were a problem, said you were getting too big for your britches, threatening to expose some of his business dealings. He hired me to teach you a lesson, make it look like a carjacking gone wrong, scare you bad enough that you'd stay in your lane." I listened, my expression unreadable. This was the narrative I expected, the cold transactional motive of a hired thug. "So I tailed you for a couple of days," he continued, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Watched your routine, waited for the right time, the right place. That night on Riley Road, it was perfect. Dark, deserted." He paused, looking down into his glass as if the answers were floating in the ice. "But as I was watching you, I saw something. The way you carried yourself. The sticker on your car for the 82nd Airborne. I ran your plates. Found out you were an officer stationed at Liberty." He looked up at me again, and for the first time, I saw something other than weariness in his eyes. It was a flicker of a long-forgotten code. "There are rules," he said, his voice low and firm. "Even for guys like me. I did a lot of things in the Corps I'm not proud of. But we have a code. We don't do that to our own. The air in my lungs froze. I stared at him, trying to process his words. He let out a short, bitter laugh. He wanted you gone. Made that very clear. But I couldn't do it. The moment I saw the laser on your car, saw you react like a soldier, not a civilian, I couldn't pull that trigger. Not for real. He took a final swallow of his whiskey and set the glass down with a decisive click. So I aimed an inch high. The first shot was for the windshield, to scare you. The second was for the engine block, to disable the vehicle. I'm a Marine Scout sniper, Lieutenant. If I had wanted to kill you, you'd be dead. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into me. I might be a piece of shit, but I'm not the kind of piece of shit that puts a bullet in an active-duty soldier on American soil. Richard Hale is. I was stunned into silence. My survival hadn't been luck. It had been a choice. His choice. The entire foundation of my mission, built on the idea of a random, brutal killer, had just crumbled. This man wasn't a monster. He was just a broken soldier with one last line he wouldn't cross. My mind raced, recalibrating. The mission parameters had changed, but the objective remained the same. My hand went into my pocket and came out with a small digital voice recorder. I placed it on the table, its small red light blinking in the gloom. It felt heavier than a grenade. "Say it again," I said, my voice a quiet command. "Say it all again. Say that Richard Hale hired you to shoot me." A long silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of his decision. He looked at me, a woman he was paid to kill. He looked at the recorder, a device that could send him to prison for years. And then he did something I never expected. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He was done running. He reached out, picked up the recorder, and held it close to his mouth. His voice was clear, steady, and stripped of all emotion, a formal confession. "My name is Clint Mercer, retired gunnery sergeant, United States Marine Corps. I was hired by retired Army Master Sergeant Richard Hale for the sum of $12,000. My instructions were to ambush and shoot First Lieutenant Gracie Palmer on the night of October 14th. He placed the recorder back on the table. I picked it up, my fingers closing around the cool metal. I stood, my chair scraping softly against the floor. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say anything at all. The transaction was complete. I turned and walked out of the rusted barrel, leaving Clint Mercer alone with his ghosts and his empty glass. As the cool Tennessee night air hit my face, I clutched the recorder in my hand. The drive back from Tennessee was the opposite of the drive there. I wasn't a soldier on a mission anymore. I was a courier, transporting the most volatile ordnance of my life. The small digital recorder sat on the passenger seat, a cold, heavy weight of consequence. Every mile that passed, every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made the muscles in my neck tighten. I didn't relax until I was back within the secure perimeter of Fort Liberty. I didn't waste a second. The next morning, I walked into the CID office, the recorder in hand, and requested a meeting with Captain Foster and the lead investigators. The shift in the room was palpable. When I had left, I was a person of interest, a potential loose cannon. When I returned with a full confession from a hired gunman, I became their star witness. I sat in the same sterile interrogation room, but this time, I was the one in control. I placed the recorder on the metal table and pressed play. The room was silent as Clint Mercer's gravelly voice filled the space, confessing every detail with cold, clear precision. The investigators who had looked at me with suspicion now looked at each other with wide eyes. Captain Foster, standing against the wall, gave me a single, slow nod. He'd believed me from the start. The recording was authenticated within hours. Because Mercer was in Tennessee and Richard was in North Carolina, the case crossed state lines, automatically triggering FBI involvement. The plan that formed over the next few days was not just about an arrest, it was about dismantling a myth. We weren't just going to put Richard Hale in jail. We were going to do it on the grandest stage he had ever built for himself. We were going to execute a public demolition of his honor. A cold, surgical calm settled over me. This was no longer about personal revenge. The rage had cooled, forged into something harder, sharper. This was about justice. The kind of clear, unambiguous justice Richard had always preached, but never practiced. The annual Wilmington Veterans Memorial Gala was the biggest event on the town's social calendar, held in the historic ballroom of the town hall. It was a sea of dress uniforms, elegant gowns, and local politicians. American flags flanked a grand stage where a series of speakers would pay tribute to the nation's heroes. And tonight, the guest of honor, the recipient of the annual Patriot Service Award, was Master Sergeant Richard Hale. I stood at the back of the crowded room, flanked by Captain Foster and two stone-faced FBI agents in dark suits. I watched him take the stage to a standing ovation. He was in his element, dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, a confident, humble smile plastered on his face. He looked every bit the pillar of the community he pretended to be. My eyes scanned the front row, and I saw her. My mother, Evelyn, beaming with a pride that was almost blinding. She was looking at him the way she had never looked at me, with pure, unadulterated adoration. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through me, so profound I had to steady myself against the wall. But it didn't weaken me. It was like a final injection of resolve. This was for the girl whose father's picture he burned, for the student whose dreams he shredded, for the soldier he left for dead. Richard stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone. "Thank you," he began, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "I am truly humbled, but the honor does not belong to me. It belongs to every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform. It belongs to the ideals we fight for: honor, discipline, sacrifice." He spoke for 10 minutes, weaving a tapestry of lies about his service, about his commitment to the community, about the sacred trust that binds soldiers together. With every word, my resolve hardened. Because in the end, he said, building to his grand finale, his voice rising with theatrical emotion, that is what defines us. Not our words, but our actions. It is the courage to do what is right, no matter the cost. And at that precise moment, the house lights dimmed to a soft glow. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Richard paused, blinking in the sudden twilight of the stage lights. A single, sharp crackle came from the PA system. The room fell into a sudden, expectant hush. And then, a new voice filled the hall. A voice that was not Richard's. It was cold, clear, and amplified, the voice of a ghost. "My name is Clint Mercer, retired gunnery sergeant, United States Marine Corps." A collective gasp went through the room. People looked around confused. On stage, Richard's confident smile froze. The voice continued, each word a hammer blow. "I was hired by retired Army Master Sergeant Richard Hale for the sum of $12,000. My instructions were to ambush and shoot First Lieutenant Gracie Palmer on the night of October 14th. The silence was shattered. A wave of shocked shouts and horrified whispers erupted. I saw my mother's face, her proud smile collapsing into a mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. On stage, the mask of Richard Hale was gone. His face, caught in the harsh glare of the spotlight, was a contortion of disbelief, then panic, then pure, snarling rage. He looked wildly into the wings, searching for someone to blame, someone to control. But no one was looking at him anymore. They were looking at the truth. The house light snapped back on, flooding the room with brutal, unforgiving light. Captain Foster and the two FBI agents began moving, walking calmly but purposefully down the center aisle. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. They walked up the stage steps. "Richard Hale," Captain Foster said, his voice booming through the ballroom without a microphone, a voice of command that cut through the chaos. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." "This is insane! A lie!" Richard screamed, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched shriek. He lunged for the podium microphone, but one of the agents caught his arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced efficiency. The click of the handcuffs was loud in the sudden silence. He continued to rave, to deny everything, a cornered animal spitting venom. But his words were meaningless. His power had been vaporized. No one was listening. And then, I began to walk. The crowd, which had been a wall of bodies, now moved aside, creating a path for me. I walked down the aisle, my boots clicking softly on the polished floor. I walked to the foot of the stage and stopped. He saw me. As they were pulling him away, his frantic eyes locked onto mine. The raging stopped. All the bluster, all the lies, all the power he had wielded over me for 2 decades died in that single moment. I didn't have to say a word. I just stood there, my uniform, crisp and clean. My face, calm and unreadable. The faint, silvery line of the scar on my cheek, a permanent testament to his failure. The trial, when it came, was an anticlimax. With Clint Mercer's recorded confession, the mountain of financial evidence from Operation Palmer, and Mercer himself testifying for a reduced sentence, Richard didn't stand a chance. The legal process was swift, efficient, and impersonal. He was convicted and handed a sentence that would ensure he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars. I was only called to the stand once. I walked into the new Hanover County Courthouse, not in my dress uniform, but in a simple civilian blouse and slacks. I saw him sitting at the defendant's table, looking smaller and older in his ill-fitting suit. The monster from my memories had been replaced by a pathetic, desperate old man. I answered the prosecutor's questions calmly and clearly. I recounted the events of that night on Riley Road with the detached precision of an after-action report. I never looked at Richard, not out of fear, but out of a profound and complete emptiness. He was no longer a variable in my life's equation. He held no more power over me. The rage, the fear, the decades of pain, they had all been replaced by a quiet, sterile nothingness. He was just a man who was going to prison. My part in his story was over. Several months later, a letter arrived at my on-base mailbox. I recognized my mother's elegant, looping handwriting on the envelope immediately. It was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. I took it back to my apartment and sat with it for a long time before opening it. It was 12 pages long, filled with apologies, regrets, and explanations I no longer needed to hear. She wrote about her fear, her weakness, her love for me that got lost somewhere along the way. I read it once, from beginning to end. I allowed myself to feel the faint echo of the little girl who had so desperately wanted her mother to choose her. I acknowledged that ghost, and then I let her go. The next morning, I took the letter with me to the post's physical training field. It was the place where I had sweated and bled and pushed my body to its absolute limits, the place where I had forged the woman I was now. The sun was just beginning to warm the Carolina air. I found a safe spot on the gravel track, took out my lighter, and touched the flame to the corner of the first page. I watched as the fire consumed her words, turning the elegant script into black, curling ash. The smoke drifted up into the clear blue sky and disappeared. This wasn't an act of hatred. It wasn't about revenge. It was a release, a ceremony of letting go. In that moment, watching the last of the letter turn to dust, I forgave her. Not because she deserved it, and not so we could ever go back to what we were. I forgave her because I deserved to be free from the weight of carrying that anger for the rest of my life. I was letting go of the anchor so I could finally sail on. My story, as it often does in the tight-knit military community, had spread. Not the tabloid details, but the core of it. An officer who had faced an unimaginable betrayal and had used her training and intellect to bring the perpetrator to justice. Captain Foster saw something in my journey. He saw not just a survivor, but a leader whose experience could be forged into a tool to help others. He called me into his office one day and gave me a new mission. The Army, he explained, was looking for new ways to address trauma within the ranks. Not just the visible wounds of combat, but the invisible scars that so many soldiers carried. He tasked me with developing a peer mentorship program, a new kind of training for soldiers struggling to find their footing after a traumatic event. I named it the Second Tour. It was a chance for soldiers to start over, to redefine their service after their first tour, be it a combat deployment or a personal battle, had left them wounded. Drawing on the principles of courage and vulnerability I had learned from Brené Brown, and combining them with the structure and discipline of military doctrine, I built a program from the ground up. I taught other soldiers that their scars weren't a sign of weakness. They were proof that they had survived. We worked on turning pain into purpose, on understanding that true strength wasn't about being unbreakable, but about having the courage to put yourself back together. Which brings me to today. The sky is just beginning to blush with the first light of dawn over Fort Liberty. The air is cool and crisp. To my left and right is a formation of young soldiers, their breathing a steady, rhythmic cadence. Our boots strike the pavement in perfect unison, a living drumbeat against the quiet morning. We are running down Riley Road. The stretch of pavement that was once the setting of my darkest hour is now just a road. There are no ghosts here, no lingering shadows of fear. There is only the rising sun, the feeling of the strong, capable bodies moving around me, and the sound of my own voice, clear and powerful, calling cadence. Left, 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 right, left. They echo my call, their voices strong and unified. I am not the victim being hunted anymore. I am not the survivor running from her past. I am a leader, a healer, and a soldier who has finally found her true mission. It wasn't to escape the darkness. It was to learn how to walk through it and then turn around and lead others toward the light. My story started on a dark road, but it ends here, in the light, with a mission I never knew I needed. That road taught me that survival isn't just about living through the battle. It's about what you do with the scars afterwards. Each of us has our own Riley Road, a moment that tests our limits. My second tour is just beginning, and I want this channel to be a place for all of us survivors. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe. And in the comments, share one word that describes your own strength. Your story matters.